Hello and welcome back to the channel. Tonight I'd like to discuss the death and revival of the horror genre. Where does horror begin? Some might say with Nosferatu in the 1930s, and I'd be hard-pressed to give you any other horror titles between that and 1960, so I'm going to start in the 60s with Alfred Hitchcock, who gave us classics such as Psycho and The Birds, two very different horror films, but very important. And Psycho would be considered by some as the birth of the slasher. I certainly consider it so. Moving into the 70s, we had a boom in horror with classics such as Black Christmas and Halloween by John Carpenter. And this is really when horror took off. When 1980 rolled around, we had The Shining, which was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. A psychological horror that just shook people. And of course, Stanley Kubrick at the helm would not disappoint. The 80s would produce many more slashers and very few good quality psychological horror films. The 90s birthed the era of the whodunit films such as Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. And it's not to say that there weren't any psychologically good horror films in any of these decades. There are rare gems, but none that really come to mind. Then we come to 2001, and we have the remake of a Japanese horror film, The Ring. Now, the American remake of The Ring really, really terrified me when I was a kid. Absolutely terrifying film. I had never seen anything like it before. It even shook my parents. Incredibly effective about the videotape that you watch, and 7 days later you're killed. It was just such a simple, effective, and masterful screenplay. Then we had Saw, the Saw franchise. James Wan came into the fold, and James Wan, as a traditional horror film maker, is pretty good. I gotta say, this guy has been rather consistent. He's really given us some good material. The Saw franchise petered out after 3. A lot of people did not prefer 4 through 6 and so on and so forth. I think we're at 10 now. And, they're fun films, but following Saw, nothing of merit in terms of horror was really produced. I can't think of a single excellent horror film between 2008 and 2016. Which brings me to that date, 2016. We have The Witch by Robert Eggers. And I feel like this was the official resuscitation of the horror film genre. The Witch starred Anya Taylor-Joy, and it took place in 1600s New England, I think an undisclosed area, with a very devout Christian family, Protestant, pilgrim family who they were settlers. And the father, because of his pride and his arrogance in his beliefs, was banished from a local establishment, and they sent him and his family off to a wooded area to fend for themselves. This film blew my mind because it involved family trauma, family distress in a way like I hadn't seen before. Now, the language that it was spoken in, which was like an Anglo-Saxon kind of a traditional, very hard to understand, and it upset many audiences. But I appreciated the filmmaker for sticking to tradition and giving us that authenticity. And this film was just horrifying because this family moves out of this reservation and they're in the woods, and the spark that kind of lights the fuse here is their youngest child is abducted into the woods, kidnapped and missing. And it begins this blame game and this turmoil and conflict that arises in the family. And we're just watching this disintegration happen before our eyes. Horrifying stuff. Robert Eggers would go on to make The Lighthouse, which was another incredible film in 2020, I believe, or 2019, with two men who were tasked to watch a lighthouse in the late 1800s, two very experienced, sailors. Incredible film in black and white. And then we had other films that came out post 2016, such as Ari Aster's first film, Hereditary, which is not without its faults. I saw the film, and it took me a while to warm up to it, but again, a very family-based trauma that is taking the forefront where the horror element is on the back burner. And that is so effective in making the tone just feel more eerie and foreboding and unsettling. And there's this term that I've heard called elevated horror. And I don't really use that term, but there is some truth in its definition of these movies. These movies are just a notch above what we were getting in the early 2000s because those films were just one-dimensional. These films are multidimensional. We have the horror aspect of psychological family trauma. Then we have certain supernatural elements playing a part in the atmosphere. And that just, that little, touch of supernatural with a family tragedy makes things just horribly dark and inescapable and just something that is terrifying to watch. We also have people like Jordan Peele, who made Get Out and Us, which Get Out, in my opinion, was one of the greatest things ever made. Incredibly well written, well scripted. The acting is just, it's incredible. And this is his brand is sort of a political, sort of a psychological, political, racial horror, if there was one. And I mean, wow, I didn't think that could be done, and I was surprised. I owned both of his films, Get Out and Us. He's another master of horror. And James Wan started the Conjuring universe in, I believe, 2011 with the original Conjuring, which I wasn't a fan of, and I'm not grouping the Conjuring universe in with this elevated horror genre, but it's worth noting that James Wan has been consistent with his filmmaking. He's been consistent with his horror films, and they are consistently entertaining as traditional horror movies. So, anyways, I'm going to get off my soapbox here, but I do think it's worth mentioning that, Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, Jordan Peele, and James Wan are sort of the new kings of horror, and they're really saving things for this genre because, theaters make a whole lot of money off these movies. They're a guaranteed success in terms of box office profit. People will always go and see horror films, and 90% of them are garbage. So it is really nice to see that we have this resurgence of horror, and I can't wait to see what these guys do next. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good night.